So, are there any other Inside Number 9 fans feeling a teeny bit self-conscious right about now? Especially those of us who run a kind of sort of podcast obsessing over every episode as it comes out? Anyway, welcome back to my reviews of Inside Number 9 Series 6, where today we'll be discussing Episode 2, Simon Says. Some of you mentioned in last week's comments that you would like these first impression reviews to be a bit longer, so wish granted. And lucky for you, it turns out I have plenty to say about this particular episode, so if you want to hear me whittering on for a bit longer, then that's fine by me. Also, after last night, I'm not sure exactly how afraid of you I should be. Simon Says is one of the best number 9s I've seen in ages, and that's really saying something. It's a gripping tale that explores fandoms, fictional universes, and the strange relationships that often grow between them. We got stanning, shipping, baiting, fanficking, the whole shebang. It also looks at the phenomena of fans reading way more into these stories than was ever intended by the creators, and oh my god, do I feel seen right now. The episode makes for an incredibly tense half hour of blackmail, power plays and extortion as we see the lengths that some fans are willing to go to for the things that they love. Just so you know, I'll be going over some general points to begin with, but I'll warn you before the review goes into spoiler territory. First of all, we can all relax in the knowledge that Pemberton and Shearsmith based their story and the character of Simon on other fandoms, and have noted that Inside Number 9 fans are largely not like this. And I can confirm this from the fact that my YouTube comment section doesn't turn into a sewer every time. Seriously, this really is a great fandom to be part of, and I feel really lucky to have the audience that I do. So, from me to you, I'd just like to say thanks. Instead, their inspiration has come from other sources. For example, the song Stan by Eminem, which is where the term stanning originally comes from, and there was a line in the episode that very much reminded me of that song. We also see some inspiration from the backlash to Game of Thrones, which Steve and Reese famously haven't watched and will jokingly grumble about how they weren't asked to be in it. Whether or not you were a fan of Game of Thrones, and I certainly was at the time, that outrage was simply unavoidable, and it's interesting to see an interpretation of the fallout coming from two outsiders. Simon Says also contains a healthy dose of misery, and it's not the first time this has influenced their work, if anyone remembers Benjamin Denton trying to escape his relatives in the League of Gentlemen. Much of the tension revolves around the power dynamic between the obsessive and unhinged Simon and Spencer, the standoffish creator of his favourite fantasy show. Both characters are incredibly well realised, and I did wonder at first if this was going to be a two-hander, as I thought they could have easily carried off the whole thing by themselves. Not to take anything away from Lindsay Duncan and Nick Mohammed, of course, who played their roles perfectly. Reese is wonderfully menacing in this from start to finish, manipulating the situation at every turn. Also, did anyone else think he sounded like Papa Lazarou when he was doing the podcast? That can't have just been me. I also like that they showed Spencer to be a kind of selfish and unpleasant person who doesn't seem to care a great deal about the world he's created. An arsehole, to use Steve Pemberton's own words. His character also has little interest in fan feedback and constructive criticism, although this appears to have been enabled in part by his agent Loretta. Now, I know the temptation there is when writers create characters who are themselves writers to make them appear wise, heroic and good by virtue of their craft. See just about every Stephen King protagonist for more details. But while Simon is entitled, devious and controlling, it's interesting that they wrote Spencer in this way, as if they're resisting any urge to depict their characters in black and white. For me anyway, this all helped to make the scenario seem more realistic, and rather than rooting for one side, I was just hanging on to see where this thing was going. As for Simon and the other fans of Ninth Circle, I understand how it feels to be so passionate about a work of fiction. That's why this channel exists in the first place. And that goes double when it comes to the subject of endings. That's when emotions run high, and it's the last chance to see if that show you love is finally going to live up to your wildest expectations. But whether it turns out to be a big disappointment like Game of Thrones, a satisfying conclusion like Breaking Bad, or if the creative team are actually persuaded to go back and patch things up like in Mass Effect 3, the ending of a journey you've been personally invested in is always an emotionally fraught time. I'm sure we've all been through it in one way or another, and it helps to make this deeply unsettling character feel almost relatable. Well, almost. As we've established, we're not all Simon. And of course, there are several lines from this episode that depict a more positive and healthy element of fandoms, and those parts of the dialogue were very well written. The idea that we are a loving community and want to celebrate things because we care was a nice sentiment, and one that prevents the episode from getting too immersed in a purely negative caricature of fan culture, which is how this episode might have ended up in lesser hands. Of course, I very much enjoyed the deep dive into the more sinister aspects, but I felt they provided some much needed balance. Overall, this episode was deeply disturbing to me, both as a fan and as a creator, and I loved it. Now, I'm going to get into some spoilers in just a moment. If you haven't seen Simon Says yet, then please feel free to check it out now, and I'll see you back here again next week for episode 3, Lip Service. But please stick around if you'd like to hear more gory details. First up, I was so engrossed by the ending that it wasn't until afterwards when I realised he finally did it. Steve actually killed Reese. I knew he'd get his revenge one day. And I've got to say, that was one hell of a scene. I like that they showed the smothering for so long because it does actually take quite a long time to kill someone in that manner, even longer than they've shown here. Don't ask me how I know that, I'm just a bit morbid. And if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know that this was a very distressing moment for Reese when it was being filmed, as it came just a bit too close to the real thing. Speaking of distressing, how about the rest of that scene? I think that's the creepiest I've seen Reese for a long time, and I honestly had no idea how far they were going to go with that seduction scene. The way he turns around the severed head, the look on Steve's face as he slowly gets down on the bed, it was unsettling to say the very least. In fact, I might need to revise that most disturbing episodes list I made a few years ago. On a lighter note, I thought the severed head was a fun detail, as I think both Reese and Steve now have props of their own heads kicking around their houses, one from the Psychoville Halloween special and one from Deadline. I also managed to spot the hair this week, which was wearing its very own tiny little face mask. At first I thought it was a blindfold so the hair wouldn't see what was about to happen in that room, but on second viewing, the mask is covering its nose and mouth, and personally I'd rather have that over my face than a pillow. I also really liked the Gavin character as a kinder, gentler counterpart to Simon's intensity. I think the episode really needed that, even just to show that not all fandoms are run by entitled, ruthless lunatics. He was also the character I felt the most sorry for towards the end when he got his brains bashed in by Chekhov's award statue. I remember thinking during the fake death scene, hey, that's not how he said he'd do it. It was meant to be a bludgeoning, not a stabbing. But careful what you wish for, I guess. Finally, I found it interesting that, in the end, both Gavin and Simon literally die for the show that they love so much, and yet no one in the fandom will ever know. Thanks to their elaborate schemes, not to mention making the ultimate sacrifice, the two of them defied the odds and successfully resurrected the Ninth Circle. They also managed to reinvigorate Spencer's own passion for the project, as we see he's got the grapefruit out again, and the show's return has so far been a triumph. Spencer takes all the credit, of course, plus he's managed to get away with a double homicide. What a wonderfully ironic line to end on too. Let's just say I did it for the fans. So those were my thoughts on Simon Says, and I'm sure you all have a few things to say about it too. Don't hold back, share them in the comments, and as usual, I'll try to respond to as many as I possibly can. This is actually getting quite hard to keep up with, as we've had a lot of new subscribers lately, but I really enjoy chatting with you guys in the comments section, and at the very least, I usually manage to read them all. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some fake blood to dig out, and some ideas for the next series I should really write down. So for now, thank you and good night.